So I'm only a little bit intimidated here. We've got 4 authors, 3 Cranfield Fellows, and 2 CBEs as part of our panel. So, you know, I'm going to ask them hopefully a couple of easy questions to ease into it, but really want to get down to the crux of the challenge. So we're here to talk about business purpose. We're talking about collaboration, what this truly means. But actually, we know that how do we translate this to our businesses, to our organisations? How do we get more people standing up right at the end of that little exercise that we've done? So my first question is actually to Harriet. Why does purpose even matter? Why do we care about this stuff?
Gosh, it matters because of the power of business to be a force for positive social change or not. And I think we also, I don't want to burst the bubble, but I think we also have to be honest. There's a lot of business that is not contributing to social good and that actually is in some ways really benefiting too much from the current global inequalities and is fostering that. And I think we really have to bite that bullet, if you like, and look at how can we change the way that business is interacting. And I mean, I really loved what they said about hope, and I've sort of lived like that for years, that we were on a gradual, things were getting better in the world. And I think it's quite hard to hold on to that at the minute. I think it is a moment of such social change, and it's hard not to overplay the scale of the way in which the risks are going up. Actually, just today, the OECD brings out their 2019 States of Fragility report. And what you see in there is that conflict is rising, there are more refugees than ever before, social instability is rising, and a lot of that is rooted in the inequality. And business is absolutely the sector that's got to help us tackle some of those problems.
I'm going to be really harsh. I'm going to leap to Anita. Anita, I've got a bit of a question, which is that we've talked about purpose almost as the kind of the hope that we've got for business. I have a sense that it might be a bit of a fad. Do you think do you have a sense that it's real, it's going to make a difference, or is it just a trend?
Just a trend, no. I think it's real, but it's still very new. I think that is something that has really come up in the last, I should say, 5 to 7 years and really come on people's consciousness in the last 2, 3 even. And Holly was talking about it, it takes time to figure this out. And you can see the change on how business thinks about climate change now, and that's been a 10, 15-year journey. And suddenly there is a lot of movement, and I think business is starting to get their heads around this. It will take a while. And they're very good at setting targets, measuring and improving. And this purpose thing is quite complex and weird in a way. So it's great with the SDGs because it can start to help them figure out where they can actually do something about it and get their heads around it. I think we're still at the early stages, but really gaining momentum.
Yeah. And to that point then, therefore, David, are there certain trends that we should be sort of, you know, as business people, as parts of wider organisations that we should be spotting, harnessing to make sure that purpose actually does become a real thing rather than a fad?
So I was reflecting very much on what Holly was talking about, the analogy with brands, because my first job was 40 years ago this summer when I went after university to go and work in brand management with Procter & Gamble, try and persuade you to use a certain brand of washing up liquid. And the way in which brands came into the sort of popular culture and came in to be such an integral part of business was because we were in a time of rising affluence. It was at the time when Hal Macmillan was saying we've never had it so good and so on, and we were starting to get a kind of a middle class. And I think purpose is now coming into its own because there is a growing global recognition that alongside that affluence for many, as Harriet says, we also face the enormous political and social and economic and financial challenges of hyper-global inequalities. And I think there is a recognition of exactly what Mohammed said in those lovely aphorisms, that actually businesses, if they are sensible and reading the zeitgeist, understand that they do have a license to operate, which can either be increased or contracted depending on how they perform. And so I think that's the fundamental trend. Yes, for some, people are jumping on a purpose bandwagon, and we are going to see purpose wash and so on. And students in Saïd and Cranfield and LBS and elsewhere will be writing good exam essays about, is it all just purpose wash? But actually, I think that the long-term trend is exactly as Anita says, because of these underlying forces at work.
So you've heard it here first, purpose wash, the new hashtag. When it starts trending, we know where it started. Gib, I'm going to bring you in at this point. You've always got, don't necessarily have to agree with the given. So my first question really to you is, are you agreeing with everything? No, he never does.
Well,
And
I do like purpose wash. And I think P&G will probably pick that up as a great. Get this new soap powder. Purpose wash. Purpose wash your clothes. Purpose wash your hair. Sorry. What's the question?
We've had it. Quick, P&G, they need to come and employ these two. So my question to you actually is how, from a practical point of view, as a man out of business, who've been practically at the front line and the coalface, how do we do this? How do we move this from being purpose wash to something that's embedded that can actually start addressing some of these social challenges and make it integrated?
So I think there will be some organisations which are, absolutely get this, and it's the usual suspects that will have this purpose embedded. We can talk about the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, we can talk about Patagonia, we can talk about Danone, but these are, sadly, the exceptions, I would say, that prove the rule. And too often, I think, in companies, this purpose thing is given to the marketing department, or dare I say the CSR department, which I know Holly has banned. Hurrah! Sorry, if you're in CSR. But CSR is dead, long live CSR. But I think really getting this purpose embedded is the challenge. And, we can no longer have companies that say, yes, we've got a purpose. It might be making cigarettes, it might be, burning hydrocarbons, it might be trading, on a hedge fund or whatever, but we recycle our plastic cups, and we use less energy, and all these kind of other hygiene factors. I think we need to have purpose absolutely embedded in the business. And for me, the simple answer as to how we mainstream this is that we get beyond this view in business that there's a trade-off between doing our business, which is still the focus of all discussions, all meetings, all metrics, all annual objectives. We do our business, and then we do good. And these are seen as being sort of separate things in business. They must, and this audience, I'm sure, I'm preaching to the choir, these things must converge. And until we see the Sustainable Development Goals, not as the agenda of the CSR department, but as business opportunities that need to be reframed as commercial opportunities, how we feed and nourish the next billion, provide clean energy, educate them, water, sanitation. It's a mouth-watering array of business opportunities if we reframe and put purpose rather than profit at the heart of our business. That's not happening to date, with a few notable exceptions.
And Harriet, I'm going to bring you in here. Harriet formerly headed up and really sort of spearheaded the fair trade movement, in which, the numbers are staggering how many organisations, both from a sort of smallholder farmer but also big corporate organisations, have got involved. How do we turn this into a trend? How can individuals get involved with this movement that actually business can be a force for good, and that purpose from a sort of individual point of view can be translated to a commercial level?
Yeah, I think that's what's really clever about initiatives like Fair Trade and others, is when you've actually managed to get the incentives right. So it's absolutely in the business's interest to be offering fair trade, because the consumer has very clearly said that they want it, and because it works well for the farmers and workers in whom you're then investing more in your supply chain, who will then give their best products to their best customers. And so it really managed to find that virtuous circle, and I think that's what we need to struggle to find, those incentives in other sectors and in other ways. Because too often, if you look, you have in a way got a whole shift. It's now from Greenpeace to BlackRock. You've got people insisting that companies have a social purpose. You've got the new social media judges, you've got the millennials choosing where they want to work. And yet, we haven't quite added up all the incentives right. And still, I think it's the pressure on companies to deliver short-term profits, the kind of quarterly short-term results that Holly were talking about, has really still, the incentives are wrong, and we've got to help change that so that business is able, in fact, to return less to capital in order to return more back to workers or back into their supply chain. I think that's why initiatives like today are so important, because we've actually got to struggle together to think, how can we get those business incentives changed? So it really is more profitable for all businesses and not just the few in the vanguard to be putting social and environmental purpose right at the heart of their businesses.
And Anita, I want to bring you in now, because you're a headhunter fundamentally, really, and a senior exec coach. You know, you're looking at the senior echelons of the big businesses. How do we move away from just having one or two, who you guys probably know, you know, we can count on our fingers how many senior leaders who we can really are standing up and putting their heads above the parapet. How do we move beyond just the one or two senior leaders? How do we help all those senior leaders hear the Greenpeace, the BlackRock voice and move to embed this into their business?
I think there are two ways, and one what you talked about is really important, that from outside comes the pressure to change, and you have to show and prove what you're doing, then people will change. When you talk about a few leaders that are visible, there are lots of leaders who do lots of things that are not visible. A few of them dare to stand up and have the tools to speak to the greater public. But and that's what I've been writing about as well, is how did leaders who weren't Richard Branson or Bill Gates figure out how to do real change and help the companies change? And what we can all do almost everywhere we are is what in HR terms is called job crafting. So what leaders did, they found a way of incorporating something they were passionate about into the company strategy. So social change, climate change, whatever. And because of that, you can spend time and resources of the company to do something that has effect. You also learn, and the company learns. And so gradually, because you are an employee that they trust, you're allowed to change things, and you know how to change things in the company, and you help gradually change the consciousness. And I kind of joked before saying, you know, David with his book, it said, take the whole company in. Gibb says, you know, take your whole self in, and I say, be a guerrilla warrior. And because sometimes it's a too big step in one go, it's a bit of a journey. Yeah. But when you're a trusted executive, you can change things from inside.
I want to talk about sort of collaboration now a little bit. You know, we arguably this is why we're here. We can't do this on our own. Sometimes we need some help and some peers and some supporters. So I guess, David, assuming that we have got kind of the idea of purpose going, we want to go as a business, even if we are a purposeful business and we're going in the right direction, why is collaboration important? Why? What's the role of it?
So I've just had the privilege of talking to some of the people running some of the top companies in the world, people like Paul Polman at Unilever. And one of the things that came out in every single interview that I and my co-authors, Mark Lee from Sustainability and Chris Coulter from GlobeScan, did, every single interview, people were talking about, yes, we're making progress in our own company, but actually, for the really big things that we need to do, even in Walmart, even in sort of really big companies, we can only move the needle very, very slightly on our own. For the big things, we need to be able to collaborate. And we need to have both the skill and the will to collaborate, sometimes with fierce competitors. You know, when you look at refrigerants naturally, for instance, that's PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, alongside Unilever and Red Bull and Greenpeace and United Nations Environment Programme in that case. So sometimes it's collaborating with fierce competitors, sometimes with a range of other businesses who are kind of coalition of the willing. If you look at something like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition that Walmart and Patagonia and Nike, for example, have created to try and speed up the identification of standards for supply chains and for raising standards in terms of creating more sustainable sources of for clothing and ways of making clothes and improving conditions in the supply chain and so on. All of those things require the fact that you are willing to work with other companies, but also very often with non-profits, sometimes with academia. So Cranfield, for example, is partners with Thames Water and Unilever and others in something called WASSUP, Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, which is a wonderful example of a really dynamic social enterprise which is tackling one of the really fundamental SDG issues about access to clean water and sanitation and basic hygiene, and therefore improving health and so on. So I think the work that organisations like the Partnering Initiative, who are one of the partners in this conference today, are doing around helping us to understand what are the skills that you need to have to be a really good collaborator with those different parts of society. That needs to become part of the core curriculum of the world's 13,000 business schools, in my humble opinion.
And in leadership development in companies.
And in leadership development in companies, absolutely.
And Gib, bringing you in now, first of all, just checking agreement, horrible over-agreement with everybody, or any sort of disagreements there? Just checking.
Why are you positioning me as the contrarian?
Because you asked for the role.
Just checking, Gib.
You asked me... If you're asking, is collaboration important, and I have, hold David in very high regard. And of course, who's going to disagree that, collaboration isn't important? Do you love your husband, your wife? Yes, I do, absolutely. Collaboration is important, and pre-competitive collaboration can take us so far. I mean, we need competitors and others to collaborate to change systems. No one company can do that alone. I just have a bit of a problem in that, we need to go beyond just partnerships and just collaboration, where we've got these different entities, be that different businesses or be that different NGOs, all dancing to the tune of separate boards and trying to do something together. I mean, if you want to build a car, yes, there's lots of different organizations involved in building that car, from tire manufacturers to engines, designers and things like that. But they all come together under a common goal to make that car, to make that Ford, to make that Tesla. If they all had, the wheels were, say, let's build a car, 4 wheels isn't enough, we need to have 8 wheels. Or I think that the engine should have 10 spark plugs. You couldn't do that if we were having each of the sort of suppliers, if you will, coming together in a partnership, collaborating, but there wasn't a common goal. So for me, I believe we need to go beyond partnerships to having new business models and a new sort of business ecosystem, whereby we will have organizations, maybe a bit like WhatsApp is a good example. The Toilet Board Coalition is another one, where we bring together under an integrating umbrella new hybrid organizations that are trying to solve a social purpose, be that profitably or otherwise, and that can actually integrate the different players. Loose partnerships on their own, we've been talking about for a long, long time, and they're very, very difficult to make work. So I think they're a stepping stone, but they're not the ultimate goal, I would say.
But let's be aware of the tidiness of the graveyard, number one, in imagining that we've all got to have a single big structure. No, that's not what you were saying. But let's also not actually completely beat ourselves up. Because if you look at the early generation of business collaborations and partnerships, if you go back long enough to the 1980s and the 1990s in terms of the generalist corporate responsibility coalitions around the world, we've moved hugely on from that in terms of the quality and the expectations, the ask that some of the new generation of collaborative coalitions, which are much more sector-specific or much more issue-specific. I agree, our next challenge now, and why the work of groups like Business Fights Poverty and why these kind of gatherings are important, is that we've collectively got to get much cleverer at joining up the dots and showing how the work that's going on in, say, Fit for the Future relates to the World Benchmarking Alliance, relates to how businesses really are going to improve their sustainability performance and do their bit to deliver on the SDGs and so on. That, I fully agree, is a really important part of our challenge now, that joining the dots.
Harriet.
And I think the other critical thing is to make sure in those collaborations we're not going to the usual suspects, because it is quite easy for big companies to come together with big international NGOs. And I guess the real challenge is to make sure we're bringing in small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly in developing countries, because in the end they'll provide the most jobs. And that we're bringing in national civil society, not just the big international NGOs. And also, absolutely critically, we're bringing in government. Because although there are many cases here where we can't succeed in meeting, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals without business, and actually I would believe business can't succeed without the Sustainable Development Goals being met, but it's also about the role of government is absolutely critical. And we have to make sure that government is part of those collaborations, because we actually need to strengthen state regulation in most cases if we're going to meet social and environmental goals. Whereas so you don't want to be further undermining it by forming these very strong power blocks, if you like. You need government to be at the table, to be part of debating actually where do we want to put the floor under which no company can go. And I think those are also difficult, but absolutely critical collaborations, and particularly if you're going to really bring in difficult governments in states which are very weak and very fragile. But that's when it's dangerous otherwise, because business can get too powerful.
But Harry, I would agree with that, but that role of government needs to, I think, evolve and change. You know, this dogma around government focusing on service delivery, be that health or education or water, and NGOs pick up the pieces and business make widgets for profit. If government can actually be more of a facilitator, I'm agnostic about whether it's a small business, a large business, an NGO or whatever that is solving that social problem. We need this ecosystem to emerge, enabled maybe by new technologies that will allow things to be done in different ways, and frankly not just blurring the boundaries between these different sectors, but actually redefining where business operates, where NGOs operate, where government operates. So let's redefine the roles rather than just keep to our old roles of what they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, but also pick up on what David said earlier, to understand how the different sectors work and what we really do well, and learn the skills to work with each other, because just because somebody has a different opinion and a different way of expressing it doesn't mean it's not valid, but you need to understand the limitations and how they make decisions.
It's whole new skill sets and capacities that we need to sort of increase. I actually want to open this up to the floor.
Thank you. Is that working?
Oh, shout. We'll translate it for the rest of the team.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think, David, you might have partially answered my question already. I just found out that I'm going to be teaching a module at Oxford Brookes on business and society. So a question for all of the panel, what advice would you give me about what I should include in that course?
Great. Take the rest. We'll be sending you invoices later. Yeah. Can we take a couple of other questions while the panel put their sort of thoughts to? I think we've got two up this side. Anna, you've got one at the back.
Hi. We all know business, is really driven by customers, right? You said it. Could you tell us, actually, are you seeing a real trend in change in customer demands from customers in a socially, ethically responsible way? Because I hear talk, but customers don't seem to change. They want cheapest. No matter what the cost of that is, externality of that is, they want, on a day-to-day basis, they shut their eyes to the reality, right? Is that really changing, or is it just talk?
Brilliant. And final question?
Yes, hello, I'm Claudia Bush with the Better Cotton Initiative, and I've heard SAC mentioned and then Rainforest Alliance, and it brought something to my mind on a point mentioned by Gib. And that regards competition and collaboration. Where is the point where all of our good and excellent initiatives are out there, multi-stakeholder? Where do we find the balance to move away from competition with each other and find that point of collaboration? Any recommendations would be appreciated.
Brilliant. Fantastic. David, I'm going to leap to you first. Advice for the nice lady on the front row, please.
So I think the clear message, and I very often use Larry Fink's letters to global CEOs. So Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, the world's largest institutional investor, he's written a series of annual letters. Each year they've been getting more and more urgent. And I find it really quite effective. I quote extensively from the 2018 lecture. It's only 3 pages, and don't say where it's from. I let people think, oh, this is Grayson saying this. And of course, he would say this, wouldn't he? And then you get them, because you say, if it was me, you could probably dismiss it. But actually, this is Larry Fink, the boss of BlackRock, the world's biggest institutional investor. And that doesn't half get, particularly our exec education folk. So I think business really, if it wants to have a fighting chance of continuing to the indefinite future, really has got to have 5 critical attributes. It has, as Holly was saying earlier, absolutely got to have a sense of purpose. And there are a number of tools that you can use. So Lachlan, who's over there from Blueprint for Better Business, they've been doing some amazing work around providing some frameworks to help you think about purpose and how you get a better sense of what purpose really is all about for your organisation. The second thing is about having a comprehensive plan for the business. So think Walmart with their Project Gigaton, think Unilever with Sustainable Living Plan, or M&S with Plan A, because there's no Plan B for sustainability. The thing about those different plans is that they're comprehensive. They're covering the entire business. And actually getting your students to think through what really makes those plans effective. Where are some of the gaps? Because unless, for example, your performance as leaders, as managers in an organisation is based on, are you delivering on that sustainable plan, unless you've got that link back to compensation and incentives and bonuses, it's not really yet real. So getting the students to identify what do you need to make all of that work. The third thing is actually something we don't give enough attention to, I think, very often in the sustainability world, is around, does the culture really encourage the achievement of the purpose and the plan? So is the culture encouraging innovation? Is it genuinely empowering and engaging? Is it, in fact, open to new ideas? Think about the way that Unilever advertises their areas where they're desperate for help from outside, or indeed from inside, when it comes to technology that they're looking for to help them. Then the fourth thing, I think, is around collaboration and getting students to analyse, what has made some of these effective pre-competitive stage collaborations really buzz? What are some of the ones that have not been so successful? And looking at the must-have competences that the Partnering Initiative has put together. And the final attribute, which I think is going to become much more important in the next few years, is back to what Harriet was talking about, which is about being prepared to speak out and to speak up for sustainable development and for social justice. And part of that is business leaders being prepared to call out bad behaviour from governments. So think about the We're Still In movement in the States, or think about the way in which a number of CEOs across America challenged President Trump in his remarks about Charlottesville, or in the way that he's been enforcing the Muslim travel ban, or in the way that the latest immigration restrictions have been enforced. That takes some bravery. And of course, in some cases, they get feedback, they get knockback from the consumers. I think we are seeing a shift in consumers, particularly with the millennials. It is still more to do with, I think, being prepared to boycott. So I personally never ever fly Ryanair because of their treatment of disabled passengers. And as a former chairman of the National Disability Council, I'm very strong on that. And I never miss an opportunity to actually explain that. Holly will be delighted. But I think still we actually have more consumers who are prepared to boycott. I always ask my students, because somebody always says, well, which are the levers that really have the most impact? And someone will say consumers. And it always generates a great debate. And I say, who's actually rewarded a company of whose behaviour you approve? And very few people put their hand up. Then you say, who's actually boycotted a company of whose behaviour you disapprove. And 10 years ago, you probably would get a quarter of a third of the room. Now it's well over half to 2/3.
So David, I think that's a perfect excuse to bring in Harriet. Harriet, the question from the gentleman at the back around consumers, are consumer trends changing? Have you seen that? I mean, particularly with your experience with fair trade?
Well, I think you've got both trends. On the one hand, it is true. You, of course, have got people on very low incomes, and you have to accept that some people really do have to watch every penny, and they are going to go to the discount retailers, and they are going to go find the cheapest product, because actually benefits are so low. And I think it's another example of the inequalities in our society as a whole that we put people in that position. So I think we can't rely only on consumers, and undoubtedly there is a vanguard of consumers, the deep greens, who are absolutely ready to pay a lot more and who are out there all the time supporting social enterprises, new ways of purchasing, not buying things in plastic all the time. I mean, people using their purchasing power all the time, I would say. But for the bulk in the middle, it's got to be about companies being ready to follow the leaders, but make it very, very easy for most people. And that's why when many of the companies we worked with at Fairtrade, the big shift we managed to get was when companies were ready to take the margin hit themselves and offer their products as fair trade, but at the same price to the consumer, while paying the extra back to the farmers and workers, because they saw it also drove their brand. Back to the point about brands, they saw it was not just about footfall or more sales because you've done the right thing, but also because it helps position your brand. And if we're really going back to the problems around trust and the absolute collapse in trust that Saïd mentioned at the beginning, companies being ready to do that and ready to themselves work out how they can make it very easy for consumers is critical. But I would, and actually I think also we need investors to do that. We need consumers to be playing their part. We need companies to take that mix of following and real leadership. And then we need investors also to make it possible for companies to make those kind of choices. And I think if we look at what should you be teaching in business school, I think the blind spot at the minute on these issues is around the rise of conflict and hatred and division. And the voices of hatred and division have got the microphone. And where are we speaking out about our values? And where are the companies? We need more companies because business has power. It has more power than NGOs, and we need business to be speaking out on those issues. Already on current trends, by 2030, half of all poor people will be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. And if we don't do something about it, by 2035, 80% of all poverty will be in fragile and conflict-affected states. So if business is going to fight poverty, they've also got to start engaging with really difficult issues around how to operate in and tackle the root causes of conflict. And I know, for example, there's an interesting session coming up later with IFC talking about how can companies operate in Myanmar. Really, really difficult decisions about how do you operate in those kind of states and in what way do you do it? And how can business perhaps do things like tackling sexual harassment at the workplace that can begin to make steps towards progress. And I know there's another session going on around collaborations actually also looking at how, and we've worked, for example, with the extractive sector, which are estimated to exacerbate 40 to 60% of the world's conflicts. So it's absolutely critical we begin to think about how can you collaborate better between NGOs and companies and governments to really make sure that business is not exacerbating conflict, but on the contrary, is helping lay those foundations for peace, which means we have to also look at the issues around inequality, and we just can't shy away from that.
And Gib, just thinking about also sort of how does that sort of conflict then move into the kind of competition and collaboration question that we also had? I mean, where's the sweet spot? How can we...
The competition collaboration question, I mean, I think we talked a little bit about pre-competitive collaboration in a particular industry, and I think there's huge scope for that. But also, I think we talk a lot about cross-sector partnerships, but actually private partnerships between companies in different industries. I think there's huge scope for the challenge in one value chain to be actually a business opportunity in another. And that's where we see new forms of collaboration emerging. But I mean, if I can just say, and I think it links it a little bit together, I do see a shift, that there's a shift in power happening, I believe. We all did think that it was going to be consumers that were going to change things. I believe power is going down and outside in organisations, and that we are going to see, employees of companies actually starting to have much, much more say in how companies are run, as much, if not more, I would say, than consumers who will, yes, maybe buy the cheapest product. Not everyone. I'm sorry, I kind of agree with you and Ryanair, but if it's the cheapest and it gets me from A to B, I'll go there, David. But how do we create, how do we nurture in your business school the next Richard Bransons or Elon Musks or others, and rather than make them the entrepreneurs, make them, dare I say, the intrapreneurs. There's a lot of discussion going to take place later on today about intrapreneurs, and get these change agents who individually and collectively can shift the supertanker organisations. I'll give one very quick example. Fascinated to see what was happening in America, immigration, kids being separated from their parents, put into cages, everyone was affronted. A small group of Microsoft employees, I don't know who the individual was that came up with the idea, write a letter to the CEO, and what do you see? Microsoft saying, coming out with a statement from the top down about human rights, and we will not have our clients, whoever they are, be that the US government, using our software platforms to separate kids from their parents. A relatively small number of employees gathering together entrepreneurially to drive change. I think we haven't seen, we've only scratched the surface on employee-driven activism in politics, but when will it come into sustainability? When will it come into social purpose? So I would add that to your curriculum in the business school.
Brilliant. And Anita,
possible.
sorry, you were...
Yeah, so from my headhunter perspective and people and leadership development perspective, David talked about we need new measurements for success and reward, but one thing I never see hardly ever companies do is changing the requirements for how they recruit their leaders. So, because as we talk about, the world is really changing, we need people who can step up, speak out, and be very effective externally as well as internally, but traditionally, leaders and executives are recruited for how good they are at internal change. So and then they also get rewarded and promoted on that. And we need to change that whole cycle. So people, like many people I'm sure in this room, have skills that normally get weeded out on the way. And I have hardly seen any company change those criteria still.
I'm very mindful that everybody's time, and I'm standing between coffee and cake. So I'm mindful that you guys also have a lot of other questions. All of these guys are also amazing authors. They're going to be standing on the book stand. They're going to be signing, get their autographs, famous, hashtags going forward. So please do carry on conversations afterwards. But I've got one question, my final question to each of you. I want, as somebody coming out of business for 10 years, what's the practical advice? What's your one takeaway call to action for each of you? I'm for the room to carry on. Harriet?
Well, I would say the three big issues of our time are tackling poverty, climate change and conflict, and they're all three interrelated. So if we want to make an impact on one, we have to be looking at all three. And I would absolutely say it is inspiring because all the change that has ever happened in companies has been driven by those individuals, Gib. That's only ever how it happens. It's usually individuals on the shop floor, in the fields, who actually have the idea and the inspiration about where to go. And then, of course, it needs the leader to come behind and back that idea and make it possible. But I think all that change always comes from individuals in companies, and that's all we can go on fostering and encouraging that that's made possible.
Thank you. Anita?
Go build relationships everywhere, particularly outside your own sphere and sector. And as Holly was talking about, they take time and you learn to know each other. And people move and people go everywhere. And we heard of Caroline, how she got her chance. Suddenly somebody will be in a position that can really do a big change, and you can be the influencer.
Thank you. Gib?
I think there's a sense that some of these challenges are so huge that we as individuals, it's too big for us to do. Or if I was, the boss, then I would do it. Or I'm frightened about my career or what people will think or whatever. My advice would be, I'm a great believer in chain reactions, and if you just can take that one very small step today or tomorrow at the latest, that might just be sending an email. It might just be making a comment, writing a blog, something that's a very simple first step. then I just believe then that you will then start to find that doors will open unexpectedly, and you will sort of cross, if you cross that threshold of fear that's holding you back, then you will be on a sort of journey, and each one of us can be on our own journeys to drive change. Don't leave it till, whenever, because whenever never comes.
David.
I want to build on Gibbs' last point, I think, because we shouldn't just get angry, because anger doesn't really, of itself, help. We should actually channel that frustration, those concerns about climate change or poverty or conflict, into practical action. And we can do that through a whole range of different ways. It may be as an entrepreneur inside a company. It may be saying, I'm going to start a business which is going to become a benefit corporation from a very, very early stage. It may be, I'm going to run a social enterprise that is going to make the most amazing connections with other parts of society and so on. And it's not just in those different silos. We can actually do things as in a number of different roles, because all of us have a number of different roles at the same time. We're doing our work, but most of us are also involved in some charitable activity, some volunteering. Many of us are also involved in some way in terms of some of the great political campaigns of the day. So thinking about being active citizens and thinking about how we can contribute very, very practically. So don't just get angry, get active, get engaged.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much to the wonderful panel.